everybody, and welcome to OTOG, your chance to study the OT with me and OG. My name is the Reverend Judy Fentress Williams, and I am delighted to be with you all this week as we continue our series of survival stories in the Bible. As I've said in the past weeks, the reason we are focusing on survival stories has to do in part with the fact that there are a lot of them in the Old Testament. The Israelites are really good at survival. They are a scrappy people. They have been described as underdogs and tricksters because they had to be in order to survive. And the other reason we want to look at survival stories is because the year 2020 is all about survival. We need to be able to think about how we are going to survive in these difficult days. For the most part, the Israelites have to figure out how to make it in a hostile environment, or how to make it in an ambivalent environment. What does it mean to live in a world where Israelite lives don't matter? That here you have this whole community that is kind of at the beck and call of the king, whoever that king may be on a given day. And if the king wakes up on Tuesday and decides that these people are no longer value, then they will find their lives are in danger. So the genre of story we're looking at have been designated as court tales. And court tales are these stories of the Israelites living in the court or the land of a foreign king. One who doesn't necessarily know or acknowledge their God, one who doesn't really care about their rules, but one who decides what the nature or quality of their lives will be like. The king actually has the power of life and death over them. And these same kings are often swayed by their advisors. And that's what makes this whole situation so perilous, is that they don't know from day to day what the situation is going to be. It's the way some of us feel sometimes when we turn on the news in the morning. What happened last night? What's it going to be today? For these folks, the stakes are high. They're like that every day. And so a part of the survival of the Israelites in these survival stories is acknowledging and entering into what we call an alternate universe. That in order to survive, the Israelites have to remember the reality they see is not the only reality that there is. That they acknowledge that this is the empire in which I live, but I actually am living into God's reign on this earth. And it's a wonderful thing to think about because that means that these survival stories are constantly presenting us with the question of what would it be like if we actually had the audacity to live as though God's reign was the only thing that mattered? What would it be like if we listened to God's voice and God's voice alone? And where would that take us? Well, we get to live into that a little bit in the stories that we've looked at so far. We looked at the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, also known as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the three Hebrew boys who are thrown in the fiery furnace, who proclaim that they are going to be faithful to God regardless of what happens. And we also had an opportunity to look at the court tale and the story of Esther and live into Esther's realization that survival wasn't just about her, that she was allowed to survive so that she could be instrumental in saving God's people. And after we got that lesson, then we had to wrestle with another question, and that's the question around revenge. What happens when people who have been oppressed finally get the upper hand? And what happens when we go one step beyond survival to deciding that we are going to ensure our security by going further perhaps than what we need to do in order to be safe? This week, I want us to look at a court tale that I would describe as the original court tale in the story of Joseph. We find this story in Genesis chapter 37. So get your Bibles ready. Genesis is the first book. This is easy. Genesis 37. And this story takes place before there was an exile. It takes place before Israel was a nation. Before all of those things happen, we have a story about this young man, Joseph, who finds himself in the court of Pharaoh. And what's interesting to me about this story is, first of all, it's really long, chapters 37 to 50. So we've got this really nice long narrative. But what's interesting to me is that Joseph's survival in Pharaoh's court resulted in the survival of his family, right? Joseph's survival results then has this outcome, and that is the survival of his family. So that his survival is forward facing. But you could also make an equally true statement, which is Joseph's survival. How do I want to say this? I want to say before Joseph survives Pharaoh's court, he has to survive being in his family. So maybe the way to say it is this. Joseph's survival in Pharaoh's court resulted in the survival of his family, and Joseph's survival in Pharaoh's court resulted from surviving his family. What I mean is, in order for Joseph to get to Pharaoh's court and do everything he has to do, he has to keep from being killed by his own brothers. And so we want to start this story of survival by looking at what happens within Joseph's own family. So I'm going to read the first two verses of Genesis chapter 37. I'm going to read verses 1 through 11, and then we'll pause and talk for a little bit, and then we'll finish out the chapter. I'm going to read from the New Revised Standard Version. Now, Jacob settled in the land where his father had lived as an alien, the land of Canaan. This is the story of the family of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was shepherding the flock with his brothers. He was a helper to the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his children, because he was the son of his old age, and he had made him a robe with long sleeves. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peaceably to him. Now once Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream that I dreamed. There we were, binding sheaves in the field. Suddenly, my sheaf rose and stood upright, and then your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us? Are you indeed to have dominion over us?" So they hated him even more because of his dreams and his words. He had another dream and told it to his brothers, saying, "Look, I've had another dream. The sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What kind of dream is this that you have had? Shall we indeed come, I and your mother and your brothers, and bow to the ground before you?" So his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. So I just want to point out a couple of things before we dig into this text. The chapter begins by talking about Jacob. Now, Jacob is the grandson of Abraham. Remember, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And his name is Jacob, but it's also Israel. So sometimes we're going to hear Jacob, and sometimes we're going to hear Israel. Same guy, all right? And we'll talk a little bit about that name. But the chapter begins by saying this is the story of the family of Jacob. And then in that verse, it shifts to talking about Jacob's son, Joseph. So here what we want to acknowledge in these ancestral stories is that when it says it's the story of Jacob, it's actually the story of Jacob and his descendants. And so this story is the first part of a story that's going to focus on the character of Joseph. Now, what we know in this story is that Joseph has 11 brothers. He's one of 12. And in this story, it comes off as kind of annoying, right? This is that little brother, hey, I got this dream and everybody bow down to me. So we're not necessarily angry at the brothers for what they do because he's already the favorite. He goes around and tattles on everyone. And now to add insult to injury, he's going to tell everyone in the end, it's all about me. There's one of these in every family. Joseph is one of 13 children. His father, Jacob, also known as Israel, has 12 boys and one girl, one daughter. But if you really want to understand the story, we need to know the backstory. So this is like what happens when you go into the store and you get there early because you need to go to the customer service desk. And you know, like I know, if you want to have a good experience at the customer service desk, you want to go early while the people back there are fresh before they've had a frustrating day. So you go up with your best smile, and for whatever reason, the person behind the desk can find no good in your purpose or your presence or even your existence. You do everything you can and it's not working for you. And you think to yourself, what did I do? When in fact, it has nothing to do with your behavior. You just walked into a story that started way back before that person got into the store that day. I want you to think about Genesis 37 that way. When we read about the dynamics between Joseph and his brothers, we are walking into something that goes back, I'm going to say 3 generations. We have 3 generations of family dysfunction. Family dysfunction that's played out against the backdrop of God's promise. So let's just back up a little bit to get some of this background. Come with me all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis 12, God calls Abram to leave his family behind, to go to a land that the Lord will show him, with the promise that God is going to make a nation out of him, that this nation is going to be great, that there's going to be a land where they go, a promised land, and that there is going to be a blessing. God makes this 3-fold promise to Abram. And Abram goes following God in pursuit of this promise. That's the good news. And the bad news is that Abram and his wife Sarai are both old and they don't have any kids. And so much of Abram's story is this struggle to realize God's promise of children and of descendants. At a certain point, after they'd waited for about 10 years, Sarah made the decision that they could procure an heir through her servant Hagar. Now, the Bible doesn't tell us whether there was a conversation or a family meeting, or whether in fact Sarah used what power she had over Hagar to get what she wanted. And that maneuvering resulted in the birth of a child, Ishmael. Abraham's firstborn was Ishmael. And things were great until they weren't. And as soon as Sarah realized that Hagar's pregnancy would elevate Hagar, she started to feeling all of the things she had felt before, but even worse. Here are women in a world where their value is tied to their ability to bear children, and that worked in negative ways against both of them, pitting them against each other. So after Ishmael is born, there's this tension for Sarah, and then when God decided to do what God was going to do in the fullness of God's time, Sarah has Isaac. Now there are 2 children. And now the question is, which child is going to follow in the promise that God has made? Which child is going to be the recipient of the blessing? From the very beginning of the ancestral narratives, there's this struggle or dynamic over who's going to get the blessing, who's going to be the one, who is chosen. All right? That's the struggle. But if you read the story carefully, God has something for Isaac and Ishmael. All right? God made a promise to Hagar about her son, just as God made a promise to Abraham and Sarah about Isaac. Both Isaac and Ishmael are recipients of some of God's blessing. We go from that story to the story of Isaac. Now, Isaac's wife, Rebekah, struggles with fertility, and when she finally conceives, she gets pregnant with the mother load. She has twins, and these two boys are struggling within her womb, so much so that she doesn't want to live anymore. So I just want to pause here for a moment, because there's this powerful moment where here we have a woman who desires greatly to have children, and then when she is carrying them, she wishes she weren't pregnant, or she wishes she would die. Sometimes we discover that the actual fruition of the blessing, the thing that we wanted, is more than we thought it would be. It's more than we can handle. Sometimes we're more in love with the idea of the blessing than the reality of the blessing. And Rebekah has to struggle with that as this double blessing struggles within her womb, as it causes her discomfort. She is told that they are struggling in her womb. These two are two nations, and that the younger will rule over the older. So Rebekah knows her younger child is eventually going to triumph over her older child. She gives birth to these two boys, Jacob and Esau, but not in that order. Esau's the first one, and Jacob is grabbing his brother's heel. This sense then that this is who this Jacob is. Jacob is always trying to get the thing that he thinks he doesn't have. Jacob's whole life is a life cast under a shadow of struggling, of fighting for his place, trying to earn recognition. And what's so interesting in this story is that we see a man who's struggling before he was born, and story after story about Jacob is about, how can I get this from this person? How can I grab this from that person? How can I outsmart, outfox, be faster than? That is what drives Jacob his whole life. And Jacob never realized until almost later on that he was struggling for something that was already his. I wonder how many of us have seen the sense of what God has for us and then have decided it's our job to make it happen. It's what Sarah did when she figured out, I've got to make it happen. It's what Jacob did his whole life. I've got to make it happen. But when will we get to the place where we recognize that God's word really is enough? That God's promise actually will happen in spite of us? I dare say, if Jacob had done nothing, God would have been obligated to fulfill the promise that he made about his future. But because Jacob couldn't get his head around that, he lived his entire life in a state of anxiety. He was unsettled all the time, always trying to be one step ahead of his father-in-law, of his brother, of his father, of his wives, always trying to outsmart folks until he came into an encounter with God where he couldn't win. We have this story about Jacob wrestling with an angel, and Jacob, for all that he brings, finds himself in a situation where the angel is fighting all night with him, and finally the angel says, "Let me go, for the light is breaking. It's time for me to get out of here." And Jacob says to the angel, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." It's one of my favorite moments in the whole Bible. This moment where Jacob's like, look, I know I don't have my stuff together. I know I have had issues my whole life, but the one thing I know is that I cannot make it without the blessing of God. And God blesses him in a way that he didn't anticipate. Just like we think about Rebecca wanting this child, and when she actually gets those two children, it's maybe more than she anticipated. Here we have Jacob having a blessing by God in the changing of his name. And he's going to walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The mark sometimes is that sometimes God has to hobble us a little bit so that we recognize who God is, this constant reminder every day. And so Jacob has this powerful encounter with God where he gets it and his name is changed. But anybody who's had a powerful encounter with God knows what I'm about to say. Everything doesn't change overnight. Jacob is still a little Jacob for the rest of his life. He still, even though he sees the light of God in that moment, he still carries some shadow with him. So that God's presence in our lives doesn't mean the absence of our past, doesn't mean our stuff goes away. And this is important if we want to understand the story of Joseph, because Joseph is born to a man who lived in a family where he struggled to be number one because he made the same mistake that his ancestors made. And that mistake was the assumption that somehow, if God has blessing, there's only enough for one of us. Somehow we have decided that God's promises and God's blessings have to fit into our understanding of how the world works. And it makes us competitive for stuff we don't need to fight for. That is Joseph's father. Now, the great irony of this story is that Jacob suffered because he wasn't his father's favorite. The Bible tells us clearly that his father, Isaac, liked Esau. He liked Esau because Esau was an outdoor kind of guy. Esau was a man's man. Esau was a hunter, and Jacob liked game. Esau was a hunter, and Isaac liked game. Jacob was his mother's favorite. Jacob liked to hang around the tents, all right? And so Jacob grew up knowing what it was not to be the favorite of his father. So help me understand why when God blesses Jacob with 12 sons and 1 daughter, he not only has a favorite, but he has a favorite and lets everybody know about it by giving him this coat. What I want to say is that when we read the opening chapters of Genesis 37, and we read about Jacob having a favorite, and giving his favorite a coat, and sending this child to report on his older brothers, that what we observe is Jacob repeating the dysfunction that he experienced in his own life. That bad behavior can beget bad behavior, that dysfunction can result in more dysfunction. And knowing the Lord doesn't necessarily correct all of that because we don't even know that some of our dysfunction is dysfunction. So the beginning of the story of Joseph is about Joseph having to learn to survive in a system that is cracked, in a family dynamic that is messed up. So let me read the rest of this chapter. Now his brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel, which is Jacob, said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing the flock at Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." He answered, "Here I am." So he said to them, "Go now, see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring word back to me." So he sent him from the valley of Hebron. He came to Shechem, and a man found him wandering in the fields, and the man asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers," he said. "Tell me, please, where they are pasturing the flock." The man said, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan. They saw him at a distance, and before he came near them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits. Then we shall say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hands, saying, Let us not take his life. Reuben said to them, Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but lay no hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father. So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with the sleeves that he wore, and they took him and threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Then they sat down to eat, and looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, resin, on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, What profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. And his brothers agreed. When some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver, and they took Joseph to Egypt. When Reuben returned to the pit and saw that Joseph was not in the pit, he tore his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, The boy is gone. And where can I turn? Then they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in the blood. They had the long robe with the sleeves taken to their father, and they said, This we have found. See now whether it's your son's robe or not. He recognized it and said, It is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, No, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him to Egypt, to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. Chapter 37 ends with Joseph being sold and on his way to being sold to the Midianites on his way to Egypt, and Jacob grieving the loss of his son, believing that his son has died. One of the most terrible moments in this chapter occurs in my mind all the way back in verse 19, where they say, Here comes this dreamer. Come now, let us kill him. It's one thing to really hate your sibling, but what does it take for you to want to kill somebody in your family, someone you grew up with? So when I talk about the underlying dysfunction in a family, we want to look at Jacob's family system as one where there are two wives who were competing, just like Jacob was competing. So I have Jacob's competing with his brother Esau. Jacob loves Rachel, but he has to marry Leah first. Well, he gets tricked into marrying Leah first. Leah is unloved. Leah is trying to get love from Jacob by having children, which is the one thing Rachel cannot do. And those chapters are consumed with these two women competing with each other to win the love and affection of their husband, over and against Jacob's competition with first his father, then his brother, then his father-in-law. Everybody is competing. Leah and Rachel bring in their handmaids. Leah brings in Zilpah. Rachel brings in Bilhah to produce children so they can beat each other, because no one in this family understands that there's enough. That kind of division, that kind of favoritism and hierarchy creates a sense of other within a family. They don't say, Here comes the dreamer. They don't say, Here comes our brother. They say, Here comes this dreamer. This dreamer, not our brother. So that there's enough anxiety and fear in the family so that everyone doesn't feel that they belong to the same family. And that kind of dysfunction supports a situation where a brother might feel like he wants to kill his own brother. Both Reuben and Judah try to rescue him, and so they save Joseph's life, but they send him into slavery, which is another kind of death. They send him away not knowing what's going to happen. He loses his identity and his sense of independence. He now belongs to someone. He has been taken from fully human to property. All right? So what I want us to think about in this survival story is that this longer extended narrative has Joseph having to survive in 4 places. He has to survive his brothers in his father's house. He has to survive the next place he lands, which is Potiphar's house. He has to survive prison, and then he has to survive Pharaoh's court. So the second, third, and fourth, Potiphar's house, prison, and Pharaoh's house, we're going to deal with in our next lesson or our next time together. But what I want to say that we learn from this first house that Joseph has to survive is the following. Sometimes you have to leave a place to survive a place. That all of this stuff that happens around Joseph is forcing him out. And he doesn't realize why that is, but it may be that everybody's survival has to do with him leaving. And this is important for someone to hear who feels like they're being forced out or let go or asked to leave something that they consider home, something that's anchoring them. Sometimes leaving is a part of what's going to enable you to survive. Sometimes you have to leave home to realize that home is broken. And sometimes I think you have to leave home to hear other voices. It's only when Joseph gets space away from the family that he lived in. It's only when he is no longer his father's favorite, when he no longer has the special robe that he gets to wear around so that he feels special, that he's going to have to learn who he is in a whole new way. And that's going to be the first step in Joseph's survival. We'll come back next week and look at what happens to Joseph in those other 3 places and how that very first episode of survival is going to feed into what he does next and the person he becomes. Just one little teaser. I want to read Genesis chapter 39, verses 1 and 2. Now Joseph was taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. Here's what we need to hear. The Lord was with Joseph. That's all you need to hear, and I look forward to seeing you all next time. Let's close with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for the time that we have been able to have together to study your word, for these stories of survival that teach us, God, that you are with us in the most difficult of circumstances, and that if we listen, God, there are things we can learn. As always, Lord, I pray that only that which is of you will stand, and anything that is not of you will, like the chaff, blow away. Seal these lessons, God, into our hearts and minds so that we can hear and see and be transformed. Amen. All right, folks, see you next time.